have three fantastic panelists from a variety of backgrounds, all with a unique perspective on anonymity, and I'm hoping why it's important for in the internet and also kind of for life and society in general. So firstly, I'd like to introduce directly on my right, Asher Wolf. I'm not sure if she needs much of an introduction, but for those who don't know who she is a Melbourne-based journalist, internaut, information activist, and gonzo political theorist. Quite a mouthful. Relevant to our panel, she also was one of the founders of Crypto Party, which, for those who don't know, is a grassroots attempt to introduce the basics of cryptography to the general public. Please welcome Asher. Then sitting directly to Asher's right is Emily van der Nagel. Emily is actually a colleague of mine at the Swinburne Institute for Social Research here in Melbourne. She's a PhD student writing what looks like a very interesting thesis about online anonymity and social media. So I'm guessing plenty on the NIM wars and so on. So please welcome Emily as well. Finally, sitting to Emily's right is Mark Nottingham. He is an active contributor to web and internet standards and is currently the chair of the HTTP working group, where apparently privacy is becoming increasingly topical. He's also a member of the W3C technical architecture group, which guides the development of the web regarding many issues, including privacy. So please welcome Mark as well. So why a panel about anonymity? Well, I think anonymity thus far is pretty badly understood, particularly in mainstream discourses, the media and so on. So I'm hoping that the panel will enlighten us a bit more, or for those who are confused about it, will enlighten us a bit more about what anonymity is and why anonymity is important. It's often a term or a concept which is often abused, both arguably by anonymous trolls online and people who use these trolls as examples as to why all anonymity is bad. Arguably, though, anonymity is something which is totally necessary in the context of mass surveillance of our lives by our governments. So just to get us started, I'd like to ask each of the panel members in turn to talk a little bit more about their work and activities and arguably views on online anonymity. So I'd like to start with Asher first.
Okay, so my background essentially was that I started using social media under a pseudonym, under Asher Wolf, which is a pseudonym. I have a nice Jewish girl's name, which I don't use, because when I started using Twitter, my first instance of using social media was to tweet about WikiLeaks. And I didn't really want to tweet about WikiLeaks under my real name. I wanted to put my views out there, and I didn't really want to have to be associated with my real name. I didn't actually realise how easily I could be tracked. I didn't understand any of the technical issues around tracking at that point. I just thought, well, if I don't use my real name, nobody will know who I am. And obviously it doesn't work like that, but that was 5 years ago when I started. And my views changed a lot over time. I began to understand that privacy is a requirement for good human mental health, that it's one of the most basic things that we all look for as children. You know, if you go to the bathroom, it's the first thing that you do. I mean, we came to this point that governments were saying to us, if you're trying to be anonymous or if you're trying to maintain your privacy, well, what are you hiding? And my response was, well, why shouldn't I be entitled to my own privacy, to my own space, to my own ability to control my data? And part of being able to do that is to be able to control my own anonymity, which, to be honest, for the most part, due to surveillance, I'm not. So my first attempts at trying to understand how to take ownership back over my data was trying to understand cryptography, which was very difficult, and I still don't. I asked people for help, and as a result, Crypto Party formed and people began teaching around the world very, very basic apps with some success sometimes, and with other aspects So for instance, most people manage to get Tor onto their computers. Some people manage to figure out how to use OTR. And then very few of our newcomers manage to figure out how to use PGP. So there was this learning thing that having privacy and anonymity isn't just about wanting it, it's about having tools that are usable. And that not only that, but we need the ability to use those tools, which means that those tools have to be reachable for the audience, and then they have to be accessible, and then people have to know that they exist. So, and that's where I'm at with anonymity and privacy at the moment.
Thanks. As Angela said, I'm doing a PhD on anonymity and social media. I got into that a few years ago when I started a PhD and thought that what I really wanted to know more about was identity on the internet. I've been using the internet for a long time, social media too, and it's always been really interesting to me how people mediate an idea of themselves. And the further I got into that, the more I saw a lot of really great research about how people translate themselves into this online space, but also maybe the thing that was missing was what happens when they don't, or when people want to use a different name to get into a different space or access something that doesn't necessarily link up to what people's real or legal name is. My thesis looks at different practices of being a self online. I found that when I started to talk about anonymity, a lot of the time what I really mean is pseudonymity, which is using a different name. And I think, that like there's a lot to anonymity that we still don't understand, like Angela said, and we're still grappling with. And I think that, I heard Cole Stryker recently, he was talking about what is true anonymity, and he posited that really, if you want to be anonymous on the internet, the only way you can actually achieve that is by going out, buying a laptop in cash, going to a public Wi-Fi, logging in under all these new social media sites with using Tor. So that seems pretty extreme to me, and I think that there isn't just a really simple binary of like, here I am identifiable, and then here I am anonymous. But there's a lot of really interesting practices and spaces that fall in between that. In coming here today and talking about how anonymity relates to privacy, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what the differences between those two concepts are, because they're really easy to shift and get confused, and they have a lot of things in common. Both anonymity and privacy are about people wanting control over their identities online. So after some thought, and this could be way off, I think the distinction that I draw between privacy and anonymity is that when you have privacy, people know who you are, but they don't know what you do. And then anonymity, people don't know who you are, but they do know what you do. That sounds confusing. Just like think about that as in terms of a distinction between, for example, someone in their private home. You might know where they live, but you don't know what they do inside their house. That's privacy. For example, if you go to a protest and you see someone wearing a mask, carrying a big sign, you can see what they do, but you don't know who they are. That distinction, I think, often gets confused when people use both words to talk about having that sort of control and contextualizing their behaviour, and revealing which parts of themselves that they want to in different spaces and in different contexts, in different situations. I found a really great quote recently from someone who was an anonymity advocate, and they said, "Anonymity is not a way to hide who you are, it's a way to be who you are." That's something I'm looking at further.
So I'm a tech guy, so I look at it through the lens of how the technology we create can help people preserve their privacy or their anonymity, to use the terminology. I think that's a nice dichotomy there. So this all touches on my work in a few different ways. Probably the easiest is in terms of protecting your information flows from people on the network, for keeping protocols that are two-party protocols to two parties and not allowing a third party to observe those. And that's through things like encouraging pervasive encryption. Excuse me. There's a lot of work going on now in the IETF especially to encourage and promote the use of better encryption and more encryption. It is absolutely possible to do. I think we can do it cheaply. There's a lot of exciting work that's happening in the background right now that it's going to become apparent in the near future, where we're going to get to a place where encryption is going to be much more prevalent than it was. And indeed, the network folks are already a little bit unhappy that we're seeing a lot more encryption than we used to see. And so there's a lot of discussion around that. Secondly, controlling your identity with the parties you're speaking to. So there's been a lot of water under the bridge about this. We had P3P way back when, and that kind of fell on its face. I was a part of that working group that was very educational. Do Not Track is the more recent one. It's fallen on its face. Great. Do Not Track won't work without legislative support, and so far there isn't a jurisdiction in the world that has done that. And more recently, we've just started a discussion on standardizing what private browsing mode is. And personally, I think that's a really interesting way to think about how we can help people protect their anonymity as well as their privacy, because there's a lot of good network effects there. Who uses private browsing mode? Okay, cool, good. That's a lot of hands, good. And finally, and probably most difficult, is again, these network effects can work against you too. The web, unfortunately, creates often a winner-take-all game, where Facebook gets out there and they get a network effect, and then if you want to communicate and get benefit from that community, you have to cede control of your identity to Facebook effectively, and they get to set the rules. They get to say, well, this is our real name policy. And I would like to create more protocols where that's not necessarily the case. I think as a community we benefit from that. And this is, you can think of it in terms of decentralization. There are a lot of different ways to go about it, but it's something we as a community need to think more about, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I think how I'm going to run this is I'm going to ask the panel a few questions to get us started on the discussion, and then I'll open up the floor to questions once we have those responses. So firstly, I think we're maybe making a bit of an assumption there that anonymity is something desirable and important online. So I was just wondering if you would discuss a little bit more why you think anonymity online is important, and also maybe what some of the disadvantages or downsides of online anonymity are.
When I talk about anonymity, I talk about it from a very privileged perspective. I'm white, I'm middle class, I live in Australia. But there are other people who are activists who face life and death decisions when it comes to the right to use the basic tools which we use to communicate every day. So when we look at the Arab Spring, we saw people who were drawn through social networks online to meet their friends at coffee houses, and when they arrived, there'd be intelligence services waiting for them there, and then they'd be disappeared. And then their social media network would be then used without their consent because they were tortured for their passwords. But it's even simpler than that. ASIO in this country right now, under the new laws, has access to modify computer networks as they wish. And so we face a very strange situation where we have governments and intelligence services and even marketers and lobbyists who naturalised this whole phenomena of having no control over your privacy because, we just want the demographic information for our database. When you swipe your card, of course, you'll get a couple of points. And so we're used to it. Children growing up today, they don't have a concept of this is not something that is, over a long historical course of humanity, a natural process that was always with us as part of our culture as the human race. But if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, you see that your name and your identity was something to be guarded. You don't give out your information to strangers. It's something that is one of your treasures in life. And I think that these are concepts that we should try and instill as some of the finest points within our society. Unfortunately, we face an uphill battle that is wrung out in the daily newspapers, particularly in places like the Courier Mail or the Telegraph, who quite often get tip-offs from intelligence agencies, to push these new national security laws in, of course, where they're pushing the idea that, awful trolls online attacking women. Yes, trolls do attack women. But you have to remember that privacy is also something that women who are abused want. When you look at the current phenomena of Gamergate, what is the first threat that trolls, abusers online use against women? Will dox you. Will physically find your documents that say where you live and will come and rape, murder, impale you on a stake. And if you're a female who is publicly visible, who is controversial, you will get these threats. So when we talk about taking away anonymity to protect people, who are you protecting? Not me, not Angela, you're not protecting women and you're not protecting the most vulnerable people. So that's where I feel what I feel about anonymity at this point.
I think in terms of whether anonymity lets people be good or bad is something that really starts a conversation about anonymity. A lot. I mean, I've seen maybe over the last couple of years a lot of debates with people who get very involved in this area, and they seem to centre around should we be allowed to be anonymous online, as though you could stop it anyway. But the idea there is, but people use it for bad things, so maybe we shouldn't have it at all. And I find that argument incredibly reductive. I think that when Google Plus came out and they released their policy about using common names, which was a really firm policy of theirs, the reason was that it made Google Plus more connecting with people on Google Plus more like connecting with people in the real world. And I disagree with that immensely. I think that anonymity is really valuable, not because it distances this online environment from the so-called real world, but because it lets people do things that they would in everyday life, in offline life, on the internet. Anonymity actually makes the internet more like an offline environment in the ways that really matter. And I think that trying to say, well, people do bad things when they're anonymous is a reason to not allow anyone to be, it doesn't work for me. I think if you let people be anonymous, some people will use that for socially productive reasons and some people will not. That's not a function or a feature of the internet, that's how people are. And I don't think that's not a reason to say, well, then nobody can be anonymous because some people will use it badly. We don't make everybody walk around the street with name tags just because then we can identify them really easily if somebody does the wrong thing. So I don't think it's useful to start talking about anonymity as something that we could just take away and then that would improve people's behaviour. There are plenty of news websites that have actually banned anonymous comments, and they do this for the reason that will improve the discourse and make everybody be really lovely and polite and kind to each other. And that doesn't work because people are still mean when they've got their real names down. That's how people are. That's not something that happens because of the internet.
Yeah, I think when people talk about this, my reaction is to think, like you were saying, well, what's the alternative? What will we do if we're not going to be anonymous? Will we have digital name tags, which some people have proposed? And that has so many downsides and is so heavy-handed that I hope that that's just a straw man, that we won't get to that point. If a government starts to propose that, I mean, they don't have that in China. They don't have that in many other jurisdictions that you think, well, that's far away from where we're at. So I'm hoping that we're not getting there. What concerns me more is when we get, corporations like Google or Facebook with this huge bucket of value and they get to impose the rules on who you are and what your identity is. Asher, I want to push back on one thing you said, which was about kids. It's about the children. What about the little children?
Think of the children.
I watch my kids and I watch their friends, and they are very, not all of them, but a lot of them are very careful about their identity online and very choosy about it. And that tells me that they've been educated by their peers and by their environment to think very carefully about that. Whereas our generation is new to all of this and we're stumbling about trying to find our way about it. So I have some hope for them. I think, my parents when I was growing up, it was all, well, they watch too much TV and they watch all these ads and aren't their brain's going to be affected by this new media that we don't really understand. And it's like, okay, maybe this new media is just, they're more native to it. I hate that word, digital natives.
I think you have to remember that your kids are the child or children of a technical engineer. They've grown up immersed with it and with people to guide them. I've only recently seen a young person who breached an intervention order because they accessed Facebook and said something on Facebook. Now, there's a whole range of cultural education that comes with use of technology that unless we talk about it with our kids, then they don't get it. I mean, it's something that I talk about with my son. You don't post this and that online. But who knows what other people do with their kids and whether they tell them. You know, we have teenagers who end up with sex offender convictions because they posted a picture of themselves to a girlfriend who was 2 years older than them, and that lasts with them for the rest of their life. We have to think about how we're actually using laws that were created pre-internet, to be honest, and how they're impacting on people's lives. These are things that don't just get wiped away when you turn 21. That child is carrying around a sex offender's conviction for the rest of their life. It's awful.
Thanks very much. I think I might actually open it up to questions from the floor just now, from the audience. So if anyone has a question, can you make yourselves known? Right up at the back.
Yeah, just a quick question for Mark. Since you've been involved in a lot of the protocols, is it possible, when we had our earlier talk talking a lot about the importance of net neutrality, and you've talked a little bit about how people have rallied around TLS, is it possible technically to engineer net neutrality by somehow anonymizing packets and that sort of thing, or is that a battle that we have to do on a political stage?
Okay, so I'll give it back to the panel. You can, I think one question was specifically for Mark, but...
Should I go ahead and...
Yeah, sure,
okay.
Go for that.
So I think, there are certainly things that can be done around to make it harder to discriminate against different information flows. Encryption is an obvious one, and that's part of the reason why the mobile operators right now especially are pretty unhappy about the prevalence of encryption. But beyond that, for me personally, net neutrality is much more about diversity of access. In Australia, I have many different ways to get internet access in my home. Unfortunately, I don't have the NBN yet, but I do have, a number of different providers over ADSL2. I have cable, 2 different providers over cable, and so that gives me a nice market to choose from. And so if one of the providers does something that, I perceive as impacting me negatively, I can switch to another one. Whereas in the US, the situation is very different. Most people have 1 or maybe 2 providers. And so that's a very unnatural amount of power that provider has there. It's, a monopoly, duopoly kind of situation. And that's where net neutrality really bites a lot harder. But from a technical standpoint, yeah, I think more prevalence of encryption is definitely going to be there. People are already talking about, well, how do we build things so that we can annotate those packets so then we can discriminate against the encrypted flows? And it's like, well, wait a minute, but that's kind of where we're at right now.